everyone, it's Alex and Casey. We did our presentation on the history and ethics of specimen acquisition, starting all the way back in the 13th century, and working our way up to how we currently acquire anatomical specimens today.
So, you may wonder why the history of anatomy and how specimens are acquired is relevant to you now. As current students, we are incredibly fortunate to have a huge amount of knowledge about the human body at our fingertips. In lecture and in lab, we're presented with nuanced, detailed information on the body and its function, but historically, we've gone from a very general, rudimentary understanding of human anatomy to these more in-depth, detailed pictures of body systems. Over time, research and documentation have allowed for groundbreaking tools like the Visible Body app and PAL that we used in lab, and these resources facilitate teaching and learning human anatomy so students can be prepared as future clinicians and researchers to develop informed, quality medical care or information to patients and the public. Our objective for this presentation was to take a step back from a more clinical focus in order to critically analyze the source of anatomy knowledge in general. We asked how we were able to learn about the human body in such a detailed way to begin with, and how we can be well-informed, ethical consumers of this subject matter going forward. In the beginning, most anatomical specimens were bodies of executed individuals. Many of these early dissections were open to the public as a teaching opportunity, but this public display was also seen as incredibly dishonorable for the bodies of the deceased. The Murder Act of 1752 actually outlined certain crimes as punishable by dissection. So, bodies of non-consenting people helped to form foundational understandings of human anatomy and were the basis of research that followed. And as you'll see in our case study next, were exploited in an attempt to prove racial anatomical differences.
Sarah Bartman is an example of using stolen human bodies for further anatomical research. Alexander Dunlop took Sarah from the Khoikhoi tribe of Cape Town in 1810 and shipped her to Liverpool, where she was sold to Hendrik Cesar. She was exhibited in London, where she was paraded in skin-tight clothing to emphasize her breasts and buttocks. She was exhibited as if she were an exotic animal. She was forced to walk, sit, and stand as ordered. She was also allowed to be poked and pinched by those who paid to come see her. She was later exhibited in Manchester, Bath, and Limerick. In 1814, Sarah was exhibited in Paris by the animal trainer S. Rayo for 18 months. In the spring of 1815, she spent 3 days being observed by a professor who took nude images of her that appeared in the first volume entitled Natural History of Mammals. In December of 1815, Sarah died, and George Cuvier performed an autopsy and dissection of her body. It was stated that during previous research on the Khoikhoi people, which is where Sarah is from, there was great focus on their genitalia. During Sarah's captivity in the museums, she refused to reveal herself in that way, so it was only until she had died that Cuvier could dissect and preserve her genitalia to later be displayed in the museum. In Cuvier's report, he described her as having numerous qualities associated with monkeys and apes, such as small and weakly formed ears and a monkey-like skull. Her corpse and body casts were displayed and held in museums until the late 1970s, based on the supposed link between her anatomical variations and racial inferiority. Her skeleton was finally removed from public view in 1974, and her body cast followed in 1976 after numerous complaints. In 1994, her body was redisplayed briefly until she was put back into storage. In 2002, after Nelson Mandela made a public plea to have her remains returned, her body was repatriated to Cape Town as her final resting place.
It took hundreds of years for anatomical exploitations, like Sarah Bartman's, to be publicly acknowledged, but the number of executions and use of executed bodies did decrease during the 1700s. However, interest in the sciences increased at the same time. Medical schools responded to this greater demand for specimens by using unclaimed bodies from hospitals, prisons, and poorhouses to conduct dissections. Even though specimens were no longer collected and publicly displayed or dissected, anatomists continued to use tissue and bodies not explicitly donated to science. For example, Johns Hopkins fetal collection was groundbreaking in that it looked at fetal development and embryology at every stage. However, many of the samples collected were sourced from impoverished women of color who had not been informed of their use. Beginning in the mid-1900s, the scientific community began to call for a change in the acquisition process of anatomical specimens. The ethical issues surrounding the use of unclaimed bodies began to be questioned and discussed, with many medical schools and other institutions creating internal policies to use only specimens and tissues sourced from people who had willed their bodies to science. Doing so usually involves an informed consent process. Other more recent projects and tools also have problematic specimen acquisition techniques, as you'll see in two modern examples that were used in most anatomy labs this semester. The National Library of Medicine's Visible Human Body Project was the first of its kind. In the mid-90s, one male and one female body were selected to create a huge visual database of MRI and cryosection images of the cadaver tissues. It was groundbreaking as a reference tool for studying anatomy, its potential for research testing of medical imaging technology, and as a model for future libraries of its kind. And it continues to be used worldwide for educational and diagnostic purposes. But even the Visible Human Body Project has a link to problematic specimen sourcing. The male used for the project, whose name was Joseph Paul Jerrigan, was a convicted murderer who was executed in a Texas prison. Jerrigan willed his body to science, but only after being prompted by a prison chaplain to, quote, contribute to society by this gesture. His body certainly has had a large impact on the scientific community, but whether or not his consent was truly informed and not coerced has been called into question. Similarly, bodies used to create plastinates, including the popular Body World exhibits, are linked to the collection of unclaimed bodies in China, with evidence of sourcing from prison executions. Though most academic institutions in the United States and other countries exclusively dissect with donated bodies, these plastinates are sold globally. To summarize, the use of human cadavers has been necessary to create the rich, detailed understanding of human anatomy that we have today. That being said, to respect the data and knowledge we have in the field of study, we should be informed of how we have historically gotten access to these specimens. Discussions in clinical and academic settings have improved these practices over time, but as current students, with many of us seeking careers as clinicians and/or researchers, we have the ability to work towards even more ethical practices.
Alright, and here's our works cited. Thanks everyone for a great semester and have a great summer!